All right, we are ready to begin our third session of the day, and we're delighted to have with us to start us off our third whistleblower guest. So Kevin Chmielewski, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
First off, I wanted to say thank you guys for having me. My name's Kevin Chmielewski, and about 5 years ago, started my whistleblowing story. So President Trump worked for President Trump before he even announced his presidency. For almost 20 years, I've worked for numerous presidents, governors, senators, congressmen in the capacity of security, logistics, never policy. Quite frankly, I'm not a political guy. Not being a political guy actually helps my career because I don't ever get wrapped up into that stuff. It's actually how I got into it. So President Trump, after he won the 2016 elections, he first sent me to Department of Homeland Security. He wasn't familiar with then Secretary Kelly. So he wanted to have somebody he knew and trusted to send over there. He sent me over there for a little while. He thought Secretary Kelly was a great guy. He then later wound up becoming his chief of staff. So once he was more comfortable there, then President Trump asked me to come over to the EPA because they were having several issues with then Administrator Scott Pruitt. Being a huge environmentalist, a waterman, a fisherman myself, quite frankly, I thought it would be a perfect fit for me. Not only because I'm a huge environmentalist, but also I thought finally after 20 years, it would probably be one of the sleepiest agency of all of them. Well, boy, was I wrong. So they sent me over there. And before I went over there, many of the top White House officials, including Vice President Pence, said, we want you to keep an eye out for him. We know he's doing a lot of quote unquote knucklehead things. We like his agenda, but he's doing some things that we don't quite agree with. Didn't think much of it. I was given a pretty decent raise, promotion in my GS level. I thought I had the world by the horns. I went over within about 24 hours. I should have knew better. Once I started there, it's such a large agency. I believe just in the DC offices, there's about 14,000 employees. Of course, me being me, I wanted to visit every office, talk to everyone I could. And at that point, you could definitely feel the animosity with then the presidential appointees, the Republicans, let's say. And so I tried everything I could I would try to go to the Democratic offices more, the people that I knew weren't fans. And every time I went in there, they were surprised, which surprised me even more. But I became very close very quickly with the careers. And every time I went into these meetings, they would all want to talk to me and they would all want to tell me the things that Scott Pruitt was doing. Of course, my first initial response were, well, they are Democrats, so they must hate this guy. It's not him, it's them. Once again, boy, was I wrong. So about a week into it, the chief of staff asked me to have a talk. And he said, look, we know what he's doing. We've tried talking to him. He won't listen. The nightmare is now yours. Once again, I should have taken that tall tale sign, but I didn't. So the more I got involved and the more I started taking meetings, I've never in my 20-year career had so many requests for meetings. And almost 5 years later now, I know why. But to kind of fast forward a little bit, then Administrator Scott Pruitt was violating countless laws, doing things that just, quite frankly, didn't make sense. Doing things that to anybody else would be common sense. When I tried to, behind closed doors, whether it was at the White House, at bars, restaurants, to some of the top officials at the White House, they were very interested, very eager to fix things. But no one wanted to take the reins and do it. And so things just got worse and worse. And when I think the thing that's really hit the fan was when I would be asked every couple months to do presidential trips or vice presidential trips. For 20 years, my job was the logistics for presidents, vice presidents, governors. And so there's very few of us in this world that do this. So the White House would ask us to come out of our agency to do these. Well, in most of those trips were with the vice president. And I'm one of those staffers that would spend 18 to 20 hours a day with either the president or vice president. So there is a lot of downtime where you're sitting in hold rooms or hotel rooms waiting to happen. And almost every time, especially with the vice president, I would be asked, how is that knucklehead doing? And I would have to give a straight answer. They would start to, and then I would have somebody like a chief of staff or a deputy chief of staff say, hey, Kev, basically they didn't want me to give them any more information. And then they would want to find out later. Once again, sorry, this is such long stories, and Samantha can tell you this story could go on forever, so I won't make that happen. I only have about 7 or 8 minutes. But my position, the last thing I ever wanted to do was blow the whistle. I had everything to lose to blowing the whistle. For me, it was never about being Republican or being a Democrat. It was always about doing the right thing. And still to this day, that's all I've done, is done the right thing. And the biggest thing that affects me still to this day is after almost 3 years with GAP's help, we have figured out there were so many more things. We now have proof of this, and I'm still a victim, and we still have no resolution. It's hard to sit with as a husband and a father to 2 daughters. My life, my career has been destroyed for a gentleman that spent almost every day of his life with the president and vice presidents. I'm basically unhireable in my profession. Since that point, I now help run a small restaurant in my hometown. I've tried multiple times to get other jobs inside of my career, outside of my career. The biggest thing that I have is the news stories that come up. Most of the bad news stories, not only are they not true, but they're factually not true. Things as I never had a security clearance, that I violated laws, and we have fought for years to try to correct these, fix these, and quite frankly, in my humble opinion, there's no way to do that. Almost 3 years later, we're at a point now to where we're trying to figure out what the next steps are, and kind of at a loss for words.
Well, Kevin, first I want to thank you for coming today to share this, and for your willingness to step forward as a whistleblower. I think that your story highlights a number of themes that have come up today, including, no one plans to be the whistleblower. You had your career plans, you knew what you were doing, and how it really comes upon you, and the ways in which information. So part of being the whistleblower is about information, but then part of the burden you bear is how information is used against you. I thought I would take a moment now, because we've had some questions about sort of whistleblowing per se. We're going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on in the session. But a question was, did you have any access to whistleblower programs? Did they play any role in what you were doing? And what would have been a better reporting channel from your perspective, thinking about your experience? You're on mute.
Quite frankly, it was just the opposite. I don't even think at that point I really know what a whistleblower was. I've said this in the past, and I've obviously since changed my mind. If anything, I thought a whistleblower was a dirty word, meaning that it was somebody, for a young man that grew up in Baltimore City, Samantha has heard this story quite a bit. In the 80s and 90s, the saying in Baltimore where I grew up was stop snitching. And so growing up as a child, even into my young adulthood, snitching or tattletaling, whatever you want to call it, was kind of frowned upon. I mean, even my city and my culture and the people around me, snitching or telling on people was kind of a derogatory term. So I know I said it earlier, but for me, it was the last thing I ever wanted to do. I never thought I would be in that situation in my career. The last thing you want to do. My entire life, I've never been on social media. No one knew who I was, and it was by design. That's what made me so successful in my job. The reports were that Kevin went to the media. Kevin never went to the media. The media came to me. And when they started to retaliate against me as much as they did, I've now learned that the media is what basically kept me from jail, prison, or further prosecution.
Thank you. Robert, I see you had your hand up, then Mary.
Mine's mostly a comment. There's 2 federal whistleblower cases that are just unbelievable to me and that I've focused in on a lot. One was Robert Whitmore, was a U.S. Department of Labor bridge inspector. He was blowing the whistle on the pending disaster on all of these bridges, and he was dead on right. The Obama administration knew he was, and they, instead of just doing what he did and backing him, because this involved a lot of other, we had bridges, so it involved local governments, federal governments, contractors, companies. They didn't like, everybody hated Robert Whitmore, but they had nothing on him. So instead, they ruined his life. They gaslit him. It was awful. And he finally won his case after years of litigation, and he was proven right. And in the end, he had to sign an agreement that he would never work in government again and gag himself. So how many lives did he potentially save? And then there's Kevin, who we're not friends. We've had conversations with each other. He's done nothing for me. Kevin's the real deal. Trump promised to drain this. I voted for him so many. That's the reason why he got in, because he said he was going to empower people and get rid of this. Kevin is the real deal, and he's so humble. He flies under the label. He does not like these type of set. I don't see him often. It is absolutely terrible what happened to him, but it's just an honor to have him here with us. Thank you.
Mary McGuire and then Samantha.
Yes, I really wanted to kind of just endorse what you've just said, Robert, about Kevin and the huge cost. Perhaps we need to kind of change the lexicon a bit. I mean, I know we've got this event called whistleblowing, but what we're really talking about is we're talking about disclosure that's in the public interest. This is of benefit to all of us. This is kind of essential to the the kind of maintenance of democracy. I'm stuck for words, just other than to pay tribute to you for speaking up, and wish you all the best in your restaurant business. I'm sure it's the way to go.
Kevin, had you unmuted, and did you want to say something? I think I might have missed that.
Well, Robert and Mary, I just want to say thank you. It's still hard for me to take praises like that, because at the end of the day, all I did was the right thing. Being a newer father, teaching my children to do the right thing, that's all I did. And Robert, you said it before me. It's a matter of just doing the right thing. And thank you. It means the world that people like you guys are there for me. People like Samantha and Gap that I never knew existed. For being a lifelong Republican. The irony of it was the Democratic Party is who got me in touch with Gap, and quite frankly have been my friends through this entire thing. What a whirlwind of events from myself the last 5 years. Most people knew about me with the Trump administration, but for 20 years, I've worked for numerous presidents and other governors. And so I had every right not to do this. And I would do the same thing again tomorrow. But me and Samantha were talking about this late last night. The biggest thing that I want to see come out of this is a good story and a reason why I did this. Because right now, I don't know, I live paycheck to paycheck, and I've been alienated from friends and colleagues of mine for 20 years. I was at the top of the world. I walked into the White House whenever I wanted, onto Air Force One. My kids called the president Uncle Trump because that's what he told them. I couldn't get a conversation with any of those people. And at the end of the day, I've still never done anything wrong.
Thank you. Samantha, I know you were.
Thanks. So, I mean, there's a lot of commonalities between Kevin's story and Robert's experience as well. And first and foremost, of course, Kevin, thank you so much for being here and sharing your story with us and for blowing the whistle. You really stuck your neck out. And, you know, similarly, the thanks that you got was really no thanks at all. And we're still kind of going through that today, as you know. And as Kevin mentioned, I mean, it was someone, he went to Congress, he was cooperating with congressional investigations into what was going on at the EPA. And someone identified that he needed a lawyer. And so Kevin was put in touch with Government Accountability Project, and the rest is really history. But Kevin's story illustrates all of the different channels that are available, from speaking up internally, going externally, the OIG, Congress, the Office of Special Counsel, the media, the Merit Systems Protection Board, going through the courts. Now we have a DC District Court case. And so really exhausting all options. His case is slightly unique in the fact that there is not existing protection for political appointees, these non-career senior executive service employees, which is what Kevin was. And so he fell into this legal loophole, which means that the people who have the closest access to this misconduct, as this person who's an insider, has basically no protection except for, you know, their First Amendment rights. And so that is something we're working on fixing legislatively. Now, despite, I mean, there's a really great Rolling Stone article about Kevin and his story. And there's been a lot of coverage and a lot of media support. There's also been pay to play crazy attacks on him, and just like nonstop, you know, warfare that transferred from the Trump administration over to the Biden administration against Kevin. And I think similarly, Robert's nightmare has transcended different administrations. It's exhausted all possible channels for help and for support. But yet these fail-safe systems that are meant to have protection are really very slow to work. And when they're working, you know, is that even enough to actually bring justice, relief, protection, accountability? In Kevin's case, a lot of the wrongdoers at the EPA retired or resigned and went on to do other things while the investigations were ongoing, which means that they were inconclusive and no one was really ever held accountable, and no one really had to answer for anything. We have to fix these systems, and there are systemic issues. Both of their cases illustrate exhausting everything. And I think exhausting is exhaustive. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Robert, did you have your hand up to go again?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't take it down, but just real quick, you know, it doesn't matter. Kevin would have had, Samantha knows that I have the best federal whistleblower protections because I fall outside of the intelligence community, and that and I'm a Title V employee. they would have destroyed Kevin regardless. The Trump administration waited days after the United States Merit Systems Protection Board went empty in order to fire me. The deciding official who fired me in my case testified. He said he was told he had made the decision to fire me already, but they waited 7 months because they knew, the Trump administration knew, that the Merit Systems Protection Board would go empty and become powerless to stop my second termination. So this is they know the way to game the system. It's just a matter of time and the will, and they did it. The Trump administration just exterminated me and many others.
Thank you, Robert. And I think, the final portion of this session, we want to sort of talk a little bit in a forward-looking way, thinking about possible strategies and recommendations. And I think we can imagine them being at many levels in various contexts. And I think you've just, in this conversation, opened up a number of sort of issues in terms of the kinds of protections and what really that would need to look like, and whether that's, even when we think we have enough, whether it's really enough. Before we get to that, though, I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of one of our special issues, which is misinformation, malinformation in the context of the pandemic. And before sort of opening that up, I just wanted to mention that Whistling at the Fake project is going to produce, in cooperation with the podcast, What Does It Profit? And its host, Dr. Don Carpenter of Georgetown University. They're going to produce a special edition of the episode, and it's focused on disinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is planned to launch publicly on the 9th of March, 2022. That's 2 days prior to the second anniversary of the date that the WHO declared the global pandemic. So for more on that, we'll also have that option. But I wanted to sort of open it up now for us to think a little bit about that and really think about the question of why the pandemic may have exacerbated mis, or disinformation, and whether and why people may be more vulnerable to misinformation during the pandemic. So lots of different places there. I would just sort of start and open it up for some initial observations.
Diane, I'm happy to talk a little bit about an American whistleblower that I think is dispositive, or at least very illustrative of some of the issues going on whistleblowing during the pandemic. So the whistleblower's name is Rebecca Jones, and she was a data scientist who worked at the Florida Department of Public Health. And one of the things that her group was doing there was tracking the COVID numbers. This was early on in the pandemic, and she basically was trying to get that information out and produce correct numbers, and was met with resistance from Governor DeSantis's offices in terms of he and his administration wanted to paint a much rosier picture, that it was at the point that she was blowing the whistle and trying to get the information out, they'd been in lockdown in Florida for a month, and there was a real interest in getting the business back and getting people back to Florida. So she was basically retaliated against and fired. And interesting, there's some really shocking footage of a search warrant executed on her home with people with guns and her young children in there. So there's a whole story that goes with it. But what was interesting is that the response of Rebecca Jones, the whistleblower, was basically to put out this data publicly herself. So she wanted to make sure that the public had the correct information. So she sort of took it into her own hands. But I feel like it's a great illustration of the politicization of the pandemic, and sort of for government actors, they very much want to get their states back to work and to have the money flowing. And I think that created extraordinary pressures to deal with data that would have been very inconvenient if it came out to the efforts to attract tourism.
Interesting, Mary, because I was looking also basically at a Sicilian example. Really, the story you're telling is something we've seen in other countries. And their top health official resigned in March of 2021 in the context of an investigation into whether or not they were manipulating the COVID numbers, trying to keep out of the red zone for precisely the reasons the review identified. Reporting accurate high numbers would have led to additional restrictions on businesses and mobility and commerce, and they didn't want that. So real incentives to disguise, hide, or manipulate the numbers in those cases. Goran, I think I cut you off before.
Okay, I was just going to start us off with some of the more basic and obvious points about why the effects of disinformation are exacerbated during this pandemic, or at the very least seem to be extremely exacerbated. And of course, the key thing is that in times of a pandemic, a disease that can kill you, the wrong information can kill you. It's basic. It's just that. And also, of course, it's a subject that affects us. It can potentially affect each one of us on such a personal level. So, of course, if you are misinformed about a particular, let's say, official in government or an event that's happened, maybe that won't have that immediate effect on your personal life. But a pandemic, by its very nature, has a huge effect. And a second point I wanted to make, listening to Mary now especially, is that it's funny to note that in Eastern and Central Europe, you kind of have the opposite thing, where a lot of disinformation artists claim that the numbers are blown out of proportion, that all sorts of other diseases are included in the numbers, that they're just not real, basically, and that it's all part of the fear mongering by big pharma or the US or whatever you have it, the bad West in this case. And it's interesting how this information manifests itself in different contexts, depending on the local power dynamics, political needs, etc.
Thank you. I just wanted to note that Rowan posted 2 policy papers that look at misinformation. And so you might want to take a look at that. Safa, to you.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add on top of the points Goran was making about, some of the sort of basics within the pandemic of how misinformation can spread. And I think, one thing that I noticed from my perspective working with, training the general public on topics of misinformation is that this was kind of, I think the pandemic and other types of emergency type situations or very urgent type situations like a war or other circumstances, it puts people in a very different place. It puts people in this place of, I'm trying to find information in real time that is accurate and helpful. And I think what was special with the pandemic in particular is that we were having these discussions with, for example, workshop participants about the very nature of information and how even the most reliable information from, the World Health Organization, for example, is developing. It is, that is why, for example, there might be one piece of advice one week, and a few weeks later, it might be completely different, or even one day later. And I think for some people, it was kind of the first time that they worked with something like that, where information was developing so rapidly. And, so I still talk to some people today who are almost still stuck on those points that occurred 2 years ago that were like, well, you see that, first they told us not to wear masks and then they told us to wear masks or something like that. And so it can be really difficult when training the public to, always remind myself to go back to these points, to go back to these things that may be really fundamental or obvious to some, but are very, very much so not obvious to others. That is a new way of looking at the news.
Didn't click. Safa, your point, it's one aspect of sort of the challenge with information, particularly at that time, right? That we didn't know, so science had to keep trying. We had a question from our listeners kind of at a related angle, which was, trying to understand the impact of the specifics of COVID, which are sort of technical scientific information, and that even if there is something that is known by the scientific community at that time, at least to the best it's known, are these kinds of technical, scientific, medical topics much harder for journalists to really get their own hands around and understand as compared to, say, political, social, or maybe even financial ones. And sort of what does that mean for how we try to improve information flows? So I don't know if any of you have magical thoughts on that.
I think it's all complicated. So it's not only medical. After our experience with COVID-19, environmental issues, financial issues, even political, follow the money issues, data journalism is also. We needed like 6 months to train journalists on data journalism to get them to the way where they can analyze big data, and get, what's the wrongdoing that is happening on like economics ministry or something like this. But yes, I think with the pandemic, even the doctors and the WHO and everybody had, especially at the beginning, many different opinions. And we learned that even science is an art and law is an art. And so I think we cannot expect journalists to be experts in everything, and we cannot expect fact checkers to be specialized in fact checking with different things. But what we need is the ways to do this, the tools, the support, and when they do this, to be protected and feel that when the wrongdoing is found out. We encourage very much for specialization. Scientific journalists, environment journalists are very much needed these days. And so, but at the same time, this is a profession where you need to know everything about everything, but without being, deep in one specialty.
Mary McGuire.
I think the other problem is that the information was incredibly complex and coming from a whole range of different sources, and coming from, countries with different political interests, financial interests, pharmaceutical interests. And I think it was very easy to fall into the lacuna, rather than saying we just don't know about some of this stuff. Well, here's a calculated risk. I think there was a real danger that the public message we were giving out was, very much about control and controlling your population. And I think people resisted that, which meant that there was a bit of a gap then where, if there was a slight mismatch of facts with some of the data that was emerging, the conspiracy theorists were right in there. So there was an element of truth in some of the conspiracies that was amplified because, in the quest for information, sometimes there were just lots of unknowns. And I think the bad actors got in there really quick.
Goran?
Yeah, I wanted to note, it's interesting to see that even in a situation where you have abundant evidence, empirical evidence, verifiable evidence, and even if you have a person that understands that evidence, that does not necessarily mean that they would see, quote unquote, the truth or the untruth behind it, in the sense that disinformation in many ways is an attack on our very epistemology. So what is truth, and how do we know what truth is? And if at any point we start being convinced that there is no way that you can know what is true, regardless of evidence, and we're starting to see this, we are seeing this. You can have a doctor who is equipped with all the knowledge to make the correct empirical scientific decision, and they do not do that a lot of the time. At least it seems to us. It's this feeling of cynicism that runs so deep because it basically makes you question reality. That's the thing. And so I think trust is not just about understanding and the complexity of scientific information. It's also about trusting scientists and experts that they have that they're intellectually honest or that they have your best interests. Of course, you wouldn't do that blindly, but it's such a key element, because you take away trust and all of a sudden evidence doesn't matter. We need to bring back trust before we can even start having these other conversations, it seems to me.
Robert?
By the way, I'm guilty. I think because of the disinformation of Russia and its and whoever's helping them, I would not have put a bet that they were going to do a massive attack yesterday. And I think when the polls start coming out, I think you're going to find most Americans, most Ukrainians, and I think you're already seeing the Russian people. Nobody believed that they were going to do a full-scale attack like this. I thought it was going to be a slow encroachment, sort of like how Hitler did in the 1930s. But no, I mean, it was a blitzkrieg all the way through. And I think it was because of some great misinformation and disinformation that got out to the right people. And it also may have caught a lot of Ukrainians, military and reservists off guard. And they didn't think it was going to happen so soon and so quick.
Just to quickly add on that, it was recently, until the very last moment, the Russian side, Russian officials, they would claim that they would not attack. This would happen weeks prior, and until they would actually attack, they would release reports saying that they're withdrawing forces, which an hour or two later turned out to be completely false, as we can see on the satellite pictures, and etc., etc. And it's really important to realize that the justification for war was created by this disinformation paradigm that they've been creating for a long time now, but especially since 2014. They've been repeating these fantasies about genocide in Ukraine, and how the current government is neo-Nazis and fascists and whitewashing fascist atrocities. They've been repeating these things literally every day for the last 8 years, for the last 10 years, on as many mediums as they can, on as many places as they can. And of course, a lot of people have fallen for it. And we saw what the huge issue with that is, because while Putin was reading his declaration of war and he was justifying the war, the justification was disinformation. There's genocide, there's Nazism, and we need to protect Russians, Russian people and Russian-speaking people. It's all built off a fantasy world, and that's what's so dangerous. You can create any sort of pretext or justification to do all kinds of atrocities, and it's a huge question. How do you negotiate or pressure someone who can make up reality as they go? Because what are the limits? How do you handle that? It's such a difficult problem to address, and counteracting this information is so difficult, such a complex issue.
Samantha, had you been ready to talk?
I was going to jump in, but I think if you want to move on to the next topic, that's fine with me too. I think we can go all day.
Okay. Safa, did you have something you wanted to add here?
I do have actually some resources I would love to showcase, but in case you want to save it for later, that's okay too.
Yeah, I thought I'd do one more question, kind of back to the COVID, because there was a question that came from the audience that really connected with something that several of you said. So I thought I'd tackle that first, and then kind of turn to our great solutions and recommendations. So I'll just hold off on it for that moment. The question, I'll just give a quick read. During the pandemic, we've all witnessed the circulation of a lot of fake news regarding vaccines, the government's intentions, and also regarding the contracts that have been stipulated between governments and pharmaceutical companies. How important is it for institutions to be able to fact check, i.e. verify the news with official documents, those misleading items of news? And I know a couple of you touched upon sort of pharmaceuticals relationships with governments as part of the problem in the context of the pandemic. Samantha.
So actually, this is what I was going to say actually before, and this kind of ties in to an example that I thought was kind of relevant. So there's a company called the Ventavia Research Group. And they are a privately owned clinical research company in Texas, and they were contracted by Pfizer to run a COVID vaccine trial. And there was over 43,000 participants in it. And there's a whistleblower, Brooke Jackson, who was hired as the director to oversee things, and found out that things were basically a mess. The blind study, there was just paperwork kind of everywhere, showing who was getting kind of what, that was just laying in the open, needles in plastic bags instead of regular boxes, vaccines at the wrong temperature, and lack of timely follow-up with patients who had adverse reactions. And so Brooke raised this internally first. And, of course, there was no accountability, and then went to the US Food and Drug Administration. Now, the Pfizer goes on at this point to apply for emergency authorization of the vaccine, which it subsequently approved. Brooke went to the British Medical Journal, and the British Medical Journal, did a thorough investigation, contacted witnesses, found out that, the company knew that there were staff who were just like making up data and information, falsifying documents, and that all of the kind of the issues that were going on with the trial were confirmed by multiple former employees. And they did their diligence and went through legal vetting and everything that a good journal would do. And so they took it to Facebook, and then Facebook basically had this company that they hired to fact check things. So the article was flagged, and people were trying to access the information, and they would see something like a message that says missing context, independent fact checkers say this information could mislead people. And then this company, their fact checker company called Lead Stories, had this URL that would call it hoax alert on their website. And so, through this mechanism that Facebook had, and I talked a little bit about this earlier, through these companies that they're contracting with to do this is being weaponized against the truth. And this is a really great example of how something can fall into those cracks. And so I thought that was a good case study. There's another company called Cochrane, which is an international provider of high quality systematic reviews of medical evidence. And Instagram had a message that said that they can't be mentioned because the user had repeatedly posted content that goes against our community guidelines on false content about COVID-19 vaccines. So I just kind of wanted to use these stories to kind of illustrate some of the problems that are going on and really preventing the truth from getting out there. And then when you have the truth, people really aren't acting on it. And that's really dangerous ultimately for the public, and not having access to that information about these studies is just really dangerous.
And let me just sort of ask maybe a follow-up question, either to you specifically or more generally on that, which is, where are the governments in that story? So to the extent they're really partnering with, in this context, or anticipating funding or looking to move quickly with those businesses with respect to any, say, potential vaccines, where were they in that kind of, getting information, being clear, knowing what's going on, having it done right? I don't know if you know or have any thoughts on that.
Well, the whistleblower blew the whistle to the FDA, and then the vaccine was approved. So the FDA knew, and also, the government gets information from the media. And so, if they're getting information from the media, that's, credible sources, that that is, an indication. Ultimately, they obviously have to make these judgment calls, but you're supposed to trust science and scientists. But ultimately, these types of, experiments have, corporations and people who can make mistakes. And ultimately, when the interest is more in covering it up than getting it right, we really have something to worry about. Certainly a breakdown in trust.
We don't have a ton of time, but I do want to just highlight 2 threads of what you just said there, Samantha, I think that are really interesting and relate back, possibly something that you said in the very first session, Goran, which is that if I'm in the government, I'm in the administration, 2 things can be going on. I actually am a consumer of information. I need it to be accurate, and I can be say the victim in the sense of I'm trying to find the truth, and I can be misled as well, not just as a member of the general public, but as someone with some measure of power in government to execute policies. And so I can be undesirably and unintentionally impacted by inadequate information and misinformation. But then also there may be moments, circumstances, or individuals who are inside, hear the information and don't want it, and put it off to the side and continue down the policy path that's intended. So in some ways that story imagines there could be different people having different things going on. I think it highlights the problems all around there. Given we have just a few minutes left, I did want to give us a little bit of time to imagine that we are going to resolve misinformation, disinformation in the public sector. Here is our chance. But to make it more realistic, what I thought I might ask you each is, in your own sphere, the places that you work the most, spend the most time, if there was sort of one initial reform change that you would like to see put in place that you can imagine making a difference. So not trying to in a sweeping move solve everything, but sort of from your vantage, what might you put on the table? So I just like to open it up for that. Robert, you want to go first?
Whistleblowers, federal government whistleblowers need access to jury trials. It is absurd that we have to go through this administrative judge process that it has a record of ruling 98% against anybody who discloses something that they believe is wrong. Gap has been all over that, so have I. But there's something new that we're seeing a lot now by federal government. We talked about the overclassification, the redactions and everything. There's a new ploy that federal agencies are doing now. They're asserting attorney-client privilege on everything. And so anytime so what's going on is when a federal government whistleblower is blowing the whistle, they immediately go to the general counsel or chief counsel's office for the agency, because they know that everything discussed, everything deliberated is exempt from everything. So you could say there could be something that's imminently dangerous and could harm a lot of people, and not even the United States Office of Special Counsel is able to circumvent this attorney-client privilege thing, which I always thought only had to deal with criminal cases or incriminating yourself. So this is a second thing that's starting to come up in this way to loophole avoiding accountability and to retaliate against whistleblowers.
Great, thank you, Robert. Samantha.
So during the American Reform and Recovery Act, there was an inspector general who credited whistleblowers for the surprisingly low amount of fraud. And yet when we had this emergency stimulus spending billions on COVID-19, there's no whistleblower protection built into that, and you're seeing a shockingly high amount of fraud during the pandemic, and that is a huge problem. But there's a solution to it. So what I think we need is the following. Whistleblowers need to be shielded from criminal and civil liability slap suits. We need to expand whistleblower protection to more people and protect them to make disclosures to more audience, such as the media, especially in certain circumstances. We need to make sure that when there is a whistleblower law, that it complies with international best practices, preferably all of them. We need to train journalists, investigators, and people who work with whistleblowers to make sure that they're protected. There's actually a lot that corporations can do with corporate culture and corporate practices and policies that in and of themselves, they can be a solution to the problem. There's so much studies and evidence out there that shows that whistleblowers save businesses actually money from like legal costs and reputational damage, and can actually help them recover what may be lost from fraud. They can help them identify these problems sooner. We need secure reporting channels and mechanisms, and we certainly need better protection for national security whistleblowers. It's just high time that we stop prosecuting them under the Espionage Act and similar acts and jailing people who are blowing the whistle. I think that that's something that's really badly needed, both in the United States and around the world. That's all. Thank you.
Take care of that tomorrow. Goran.
I just also wanted to say before I go straight to my answer is that it's a great way that the question was asked in such a way, because in terms of what we need in our local context, because that's really important, right? We're coming from different countries, each country is the different step in the process, let's say. And so countries like Bulgaria, for example, my country, we have a complete and total lack of the institutional infrastructure that we would need to even know about disinformation and track what's going on, let alone, deter it and prevent it from happening. So it's absolutely fundamental that the Bulgarian government, with contribution from civil society and using public-private partnerships, starts establishing a body that's similar to the US GEC, which has been the global center of engagement, which has been around for years now, or the recently revealed Psychological Defense Agency in Sweden. Those are some really good examples. At the same time, one of the issues with these sort of bodies is that they're limited to only looking at outlets and the content of outlets that are outside the country. And the sad reality is that a lot of the disinformation, a majority of the disinfo, is produced by local actors, maybe in the service of local or external actors, but it's produced locally. And so we definitely have to think of how we can monitor certain media without actually breaching their fundamental rights, because that's the limitation. That's why those agencies don't do it in the first place. It's a very good reason, and I'm definitely not saying that we should change that. But what I'm saying is that we should definitely, even if you do institute such infrastructure, such institutions, they do need to monitor as much information as they can and not put these artificial limitations on them, because that's what they are ultimately. They're artificial, they don't reflect reality. Thank you.
Mary McGuire, you had your hand up before, or your?
Yes, I think it was going back to the point that Goran made about, what can you do within your sphere of influence, and for me, this is definitely within, the kind of education sector with young people, whether or not that's working with trainee journalists or whether it's working with media lawyers, or training media lawyers, about what to look for, and about how to authenticate what you're hearing, about looking at kind of different ways of verifying information, because actually if we're going to have that vehicle that's going to enable whistleblowers, without the protections, to amplify the kind of issue. We've seen lots of kind of, sometimes the excessive punitive measures are themselves an alert to journalists, and to lawyers. Where someone has really kind of got a heavy hammer and you're thinking, why, hang on a minute, this needs investigating. So it's about kind of getting young people to sort of like start being a bit more literate about organizations and about the kind of threats to the Constitution and the threats to their civil liberties. So, yeah.
Thank you. Safa, then Rowan.
Yeah, I think this is probably the perfect place for me to add on. Mary was talking about verification skills, and actually I would just like to highlight 2 projects at Tactical Tech. We actually have a bunch more, but I think the 2 that are most interesting for this topic is, if anyone's listening into this because they want to get started in verification, check out the Digital Inquirer Kit. It's a brand new course that we created, an e-learning course. It's free online. We're a nonprofit. It's all Creative Commons, and it teaches verification skills and how to conduct research safely, with your well-being at heart. And if you want to go further, let's say you're not an absolute beginner and you want to go a bit further, check out our other project called Exposing the Invisible, which is an incredible library of resources for anyone who is interested in investigating journalism, reporting, researching on a small scale in their community, or doing a great big project with other collaborators. So I really recommend those projects.
Thanks a lot. I just shared, in the chat, the Arab Fact Checkers Network, which is a network where we are supporting fact checkers across the region. There is around 50 initiative centers. We have signed memorandum of understanding with 20 of them, and the focus is on the pre-publication fact checking and not only the post, which is a problem that, many people focus on the post-publication fact checking rather than the pre-publication fact checking. And I would add also the sentence that Robert said about, whistleblowers not allowed and not invited in academia and universities to speak. I think the most important that we engage with education and get students at the schools and university level to have critical thinking and get whistleblowers to speak out and not be silent, and get invited into these sessions, because education is in our region, as it's very difficult to reform from up to down. Our way is from education to up.
Mary Inman, you had unmuted.
Yeah, so these are all great suggestions, and going back to Goran's point, staying with my area of expertise, which is United States whistleblower law, but even more specifically, I would love to point out the hypocrisy to the United States government of the fact that on the one hand, when there are private contractors who are cheating the government, they love whistleblowers. They love them so much that they pay 10 to 30% of any fine imposed. And so why is it that we have created and seen the importance of putting a financial safety net under whistleblowers who have to dip into their 401ks, who are not, employed or at the top of their professions? We see fit to pay them and lionize them in any number of programs from the SEC, CFTC, IRS, DOJ on the one hand, and then on the other hand, when you're a government whistleblower, when it's actually the mirrors being held up to you, then we don't like whistleblowers. So I think we need to think about models for how do we put a financial safety net under whistleblowers. I know, amazing work that Samantha and GAP and the IBA have done in looking at the laws around the world for whistleblower protections. But the reality in the courtroom is that it's very difficult to win a retaliation case. And so I think we need to get really creative in thinking about, does some of the money that that SEC whistleblowers get? Is some of that created for a pool for government whistleblowers? I don't know. I don't have the answers, but I am intently listening on the international scale to what is going on with the EU whistleblowing directive, where we're seeing countries creating houses of the whistleblower as an office in government. In the Netherlands, there's the House of the Whistleblower. In the UK, there's legislation being proposed for an office of the whistleblower. We need to not be segmented. We need to put supports around these amazing people from Grant and Kevin and Robert and hearing their stories. And the last thing I will say, which is not a legal answer, is we need to have a job board for whistleblowers. And we need to have a social movement that puts pressure on companies and the government to hire whistleblowers, because of Samantha's point, which is that look at the enormous brain drain. We're in the middle of a great resignation, and we have these talented people, 3 of whom are on this call. Luckily, Grant is gainfully employed, but the fact that Kevin has this enormous expertise and that he's not employed right now is a national tragedy. And we're starting to see these job boards showing up. There's a great group called Lioness that is starting to vet good employers and trying to actually pair them with whistleblowers. I encourage you, Kevin, Robert, others, to look at Lioness's job board for some good employers who are actually looking for whistleblowers and knowing that you are actually, not only are you not disloyal, you're the most loyal employees because you're willing to speak the hard truths.
Thank you, Mary. Robert.
Yeah, just a quick dovetail on what Mary I just said. I'm glad she said it, because coming from me sounds, biased. But yeah, so the SEC and the IRS gives millions to these whistleblowers, and they live in chateaus. I know one lives in is building a multi-million-dollar chateau in Italy. And the SEC, who are federal employees, and the IRS employees, they have these weak protections that I have. And let's say they blow the whistle on a program that's maybe giving somebody too much money or shouldn't be giving money. They're probably not going to blow the whistle, because federal government employee whistleblowers have really weak protections. And yeah, I mean, we don't want to get rich. We just want to pay the bills and feed our kids. I haven't paid my mortgage in almost 3 years. I'm on welfare. I collect food stamps, and I live like a cockroach. And it's just day to day. But I fight on. And Kevin, you could tell it's not right what he's going through, and somebody needs to reach out to him. And his basic bills need to be paid while this goes on. Something. So thank you for bringing that up, Mary.
And thank you, Robert, for highlighting a little bit more on that. As we close out, 3 quick things I want to say. One of the questions in the Q&A relates to something we talked about earlier. I think, Goran, it was something you had said about trust and the loss of trust. And the question was sort of, how do you get public trust again? And maybe whether transparency is part of it. That led me to think, to the extent a lot of our conversation just now has really been about strengthening the ability for whistleblowers to do what they do. If that does lead in part to, far greater transparency, is that again part of the path towards increased trust? I don't know. I wanted to also mention a couple times people were talking about education. We're recording these sessions and they are posted on the Whistling at the Fake website. So it might be a useful resource for those of you that are engaged in sort of educational outreach, portions of those to consider. Finally, I just wanted to mention that over the course of the next week, we'll be launching an international open poster competition for undergraduate, postgraduate, and doctoral students focused on mal, mis, and disinformation. And we'll be organizing a final international conference in May. That will be our final moment of reflection on the many topics that we've really tried to bring out through these sessions. So with that, I would like to really thank all of our panelists, in particular, our 3 whistleblowers, Grant Turner, Robert McLean, and Kevin Chmielewski. Really, really grateful both for the work you've done and for your willingness to join us here today. And then I would also love to thank all of our other panelists, really, who've helped us look at these questions through many perspectives across the globe, across fields, and I think added to our better understanding. So thank you as well, and have a wonderful afternoon.